Welcome to the Innovation Island podcast. And right now, in fact, I'm sitting with Harsha Silva, economist and politician and member of the parliament, government of Sri Lanka. Some interesting deliberations just happened on the blue economy. And in continuation with that, there have been a host of questions that have been floated. Interestingly, when we talked about the blue economy, one very critical stretch that comes to mind is how can India and Sri Lanka collaborate in a much more congenial framework, given the fact that from a geopolitical and a geoeconomic perspective, host of developments have been happening in the backdrop, and in the process, there remains a huge potential which remain to be unexplored in the form of the blue economy and the stretch that common stretch that remains between the two nations. So, given this, Harsha, where do you think that a collaboration can happen between the two nations? And because a host of it remains unexplored till a point in time.
I mean, we have been collaborating for millennia, and it is in this new context. How do we establish some guidelines, binding agreements that both countries can benefit? So let me take a few points. One is the unexplored potential in offshore wind in the Mana Straits that you just referred to. Recently, a World Bank study was done, and they said, look, you can potentially develop perhaps up to 60 gigawatts of wind energy there. Some in the shallow, some in the deep sea. And we don't need that much of energy. Sri Lanka is still a small country, growing nevertheless. So how do we collaborate to use that the wind energy that we produce? So what kind of agreements do we enter into? Who is going to make the investments? Now, what we had planned was to collaborate to build HVC line between the island and India. Now, for that, we need policy. So we brought in a new electricity act that provided for this type of activity to take place. But then, changes in policy obviously puts a halt to exploring that potential that exists. So we need to really sit down and think whether it should be just between Sri Lanka and India or whether it should be a broad sort of BIMSTEC or something like that. But we must come up with a sustainable mechanism where people are willing to bring money in, because I was listening to the panel and you talked about financing, blue economy, economic sort of potential projects. Because at the end of the day, there has to be money put in for anything to happen, exactly. Right? So that's one. And the second thing is, you see, on fishing, and this is a contentious issue that I also brought up in the panel, is what you call bottom trawling. How Indian fishermen from the south sort of encroach our waters on a daily basis and sort of take the fish back to India. So that affects the livelihood of Sri Lankan fishermen, particularly in the north. And this discussion has been going on for, I think, decades now.
It has been continuing. It has happening on both sides to a large extent. So discussion has been happening for quite some time.
Yes, but the issue really is the number of vessels that come from the Indian side to the Sri Lankan side far exceeds the
number of encroachments that are happening on the other side.
That's right. But then you see, we had to deal with the European Union some time back because those IUU legislation really is binding. And what they said is, look, we give you tariff concession to the European Union, we are going to stop it. if you don't comply. And that meant we lost about $250 million of exports to the European Unions. And then that sort of, got us to comply. So these are the things I think we need to consider and figure out how we can sort of move ahead.
No, given that you talked about wind energy, the fact remains that you have quite a large capital expenditure, capex on this, but operating cost, of course, is going to be much, it's almost nominal or much less. So is there any specific figure that you have come up with, that this is the total amount of investment that is needed?
Well, I mean, that it costs are coming down. Let me take a current example, which is a hot topic in Colombo right now, is Adani Green Energy.
Yes.
Just pulled out of approximately $1 billion investment in Sri Lanka. Probably, I think it's 2 plants or 3 put together is probably close to 1,000 megawatts. So it's about perhaps, that's the ratio. Now, the issue was on the tariff, on the power purchase agreement. And the government basically said, the president announced in his budget, referring to this particular transaction, look, we need competitive pricing. And we were able to get from 50 megawatt project in the same region, a kilowatt hour for something like 0.48 US cents, whereas the Adani project PPA was set at something like 0.82 US cents. Now, this needed to have been negotiated and found some way so that we could bring the large capital that needs to be brought in. Because the government of Sri Lanka is running on a very tight budget based on the IMF's agreement that we entered into after the crisis, which caps our expenditure at 13% of GDP. So let us suppose that we have 20% of GDP in revenue. Correct. We cannot use that, right? Because we have to pay back our debt,
Yes.
right? So in that context, we have to be pragmatic about how do we work with investors without saying, look, putting up big blocks and the investor sort of runs away. So I am, for a moment, not saying we should buy a unit at 8 American cents. That's too high, right? But at the time that this was agreed into, we were in a bit of a mess, right? Our country was in default. Nobody was willing to invest in this country. So anybody who was able to come in, needed a large premium, right? Now that is gone, right? We could even have a step-down tariff of some sort so that, when our ratings go up, when our economy improves, then they can continue to reduce rates or something like that. So the point is, we need to create a environment, a policy, legislative framework where we can get that capital expenditure into Sri Lanka. So this is a conversation that must be addressed immediately. The more we delay, the more the problem is going to be for us in our own sort of sufficiency of generating electricity.
True. So, given this, that you have to, of course, you have to do private investment that is critical across all the sectors. Now, I have 2 questions here. That what are the reforms that are being made, in fact, in Sri Lanka in order to create a more business-enabling environment so that the return on investment actually gets enhanced in the process?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point because, I know, for full disclosure, I'm a member of the opposition, right? So the previous government, which we were still in the opposition but supported this piece of legislation, was a new Electricity Act. Now, that provides for private investment in generation, in transmission, and in distribution. Okay. Right? Currently, we have this massive integrated utility monopoly. And it is it was supposed to be unbundled into these three groups and then, provide opportunities for private investment. Now, this new government is talking about sort of, going back on this reform. And they are saying, look, all current generating assets of the state monopoly will continue to be owned 100% by the state. This is as opposed to, as you probably know, Sri Lanka has a lot of hydro. The large Mahavali, huge dams, Victoria, Randanigala, Rantambe. And those were anyway supposed to be in perpetuity with the people. But there are other projects like generating assets like coal and wind and solar, which there is no real reason for us to hold 100%. So you give a hook where you can get private investments to come in, right? Because even now anyone can put up a solar plant or a ground-mounted solar, floating solar or wind and, do their thing and sell to the utility. But by doing this, right, you're closing the opportunities that are available, because private sector looks at opportunities in slightly different way than public policy people or politicians sitting in Colombo. The second point is, let us suppose even big Indian or any other likely Indian investment comes into sort of wind or solar. You need to evacuate that power that gets generated. And in order to do that, you got to build transmission lines. Now, the government is saying, look, here on going forward, we will own 100% of transmission capacity, the entire network. And if a private investor wants to put in money to build transmission capacity, the government will have to own 50% of it. So you're not creating a conducive environment for private investment to come in, and also close all doors for distribution companies, private investment in distribution companies. So the policy must be forward-looking. The policy must be open to private investment. The policy must be encouraging. So this is which I'm very critical of sort of reversing the reforms will not help Sri Lanka leverage its massive potential that we have in renewable energy.
So one last question. If we at all have to think about, say, developing wind or even, say, wave, that is also a massive blue economic potential that exists in this part of the world. What kind of institutional mechanism would you really think about? Bilateral, India-Sri Lanka, BIMSTEC, multilateral, trilateral? What is it that you would recommend?
I mean, I worked before this in my previous life, worked with the ADB in both Nepal and Bhutan. I saw how the Bhutanese really used Indian investment to build their hydro, run of the river, the mountainous regions, and how they started selling electricity to India. Of course, the first PPAs, I think, were not very equitable, I must say. But later on, they have become, much more globally acceptable and transparent and equitable transactions. And now I think the largest foreign exchange earner for a government of Bhutan is selling electricity to India and beyond. But what happened in Nepal was, of course, the political environment was so bad that no investments came in. So there are examples for us to learn from. And if you look at sort of the South Asian regionally integrated sort of network that we can think about, you can sell to the Indian grid, and then Indian grid can sell to someone else, or this can be integrated in some way. So I think, first of all, it has to be between Sri Lanka and India, right? And that's the first step. The second step can be sort of a broader Pakistan, maybe Nepal, maybe, sorry, not Nepal, other deficit countries, Bangladesh maybe, right? So since the connection between certain countries are not very strong, you can even bypass you see, if you are in a more integrated network. But I think one, institutional framework should be Sri Lanka, India, and two, expand to the South Asian region.
Okay. So thank you, Harsha. It's a very nice conversation out of which a host of opportunities that can be explored in the context of this expansive blue economy in this part of the world have been talked of. Thanks for being there.
Thank you, Niraj.